Thank you. Over here. My name is Spaa. I'm from Northumbria University. I'm a second-year PhD student, like all the other speakers in this session. And together with you, I hope to help you understand the boundaries of policymaking and HCI. So our main question that drives this research is to find out how we can have HCI engage more with policymaking. So in this talk, in this study, we interviewed 11 professionals who see policy informing as part of their professional practice. So we spoke with people ranging across think tanks and HCI researchers and asked them about their experiences of informing policy with research evidence. So from the paper, we will go into 3 particular themes. I'll start with going into why and how we communicate evidence to policymaking and why we believe it's worthwhile to bring together HCI research under specific policy topics. After that, I will go into the stories that policy informers have shared with us on how they experiment with new types of evidence, and that we see that there's a potential really interesting opportunity for researchers who combine participatory and speculative research methods. So throughout the paper and also in this talk, we distinguish between several terms. There's definitions on the slide, but I'll illustrate it with a quick example. So policy is a statement of intent. We talk about public policy, so it's a governmental statement of intent. For example, Newcastle City Centre wants to improve their air quality. The implementation of this policy is to lower the amount of traffic in the Newcastle City Centre. The policymaker therefore has the professional job to evaluate the best way of implementing this policy and trying to find out what is the best way to achieve the intent. For example, in the UK, there's a development of evidence-based policymaking, meaning that rather than driving decisions based on ideology, you drive decisions based on evidence. But from a HCI perspective, as a HCI researcher who wants to inform policymaker, we sit outside that professional practice. Instead, our professional practice could be to inform policy. So we bring evidence to policymakers, hoping that it can influence the decisions that they make. Alongside academia, there's research institutions, think tanks, and charities that also, amongst others, also try to influence policy. So to give a bit of a sense of what policymaker practices looks like, at least in the UK, I have this image from Policy Lab, and it tells us how dense and how complex policymaking is. As a reference, it takes about 7 minutes to explain this infographic in a video. But the focus of our research and also the positioning of the policy informers that we spoke to, we have highlighted several aspects of this practice. So the participants in our work are think tankers or researchers who try to influence the new policy ideas by bringing evidence to policymakers, hoping that they can influence the final policy document. So to give you a bit more information about how we came to the participants, we spoke to 7 UK-based think tanks and 4 HCI researchers. This is not a comparative study, but we wanted to see whether there's any overlap between the stories that both of these participant groups shared, the kind of experiences they had as policy informers. So recruiting the HCI researchers, we looked primarily at the people that have openly discussed being involved in policy informing. There was a small element of snowball recruitment in this selection as well. Think tanks, we've decided to... So first I made a long list of think tanks that I could find online. I happened to stumble across a definition on what a credible think tank is, meaning that it's a think tank that states its biases up front, is research-driven, is not particularly affiliated to any political party, and is intellectually independent. Based on that definition, I made a sub-selection, and from that selection, I chose specific think tanks that have been in touch with the HCI community in any way, being through collaboration of participating in HCI events. In order to complement the list of think tank participants, I selected several think tanks that were considered credible within the UK. So this resulted in a series of interview transcripts that describe the experiences of these policy informers and who see that as part of their professional practice. I've analyzed those thematically based on Brown and Clark's paper, but more detail on that can be found in the paper. So to go into the first theme, what does it mean to make HCI evidence visible to policymakers, and how can we communicate that clearly? So one of the first things that we came across in the interviews was that it's really that we're dealing with a major difference in worldviews. The way HCI researchers look at the world is very different from how we HCI researchers look at the world. And as we have such different worldviews, the language that we have developed in order to explain the world is very different. So in order to have a suitable policy advice, we need to be in tune with the different policies audiences that we talk to. This is something that was said by participant 5, who is a think tank advisor. But he also mentioned that being visible alone is not enough. You need to be relevant. Knowing what is relevant to a policy maker and at what point in their process is an important part of policy informing. So in order to, as we bring forward this quote from participant 5, that we should play according to the rules of policymakers and use their language. It's important to to position the study from a more critical note. So yes, we are very aware that policy informing is a political practice, and there's many critiques around evidence-based policymaking, because although the intention is to use evidence-based policymaking and the evidence that is included in this process to inform policy decisions, sometimes this evidence is rather used to justify decisions that makers already wanted to make in the first place. So when we want to develop a policy informing tradition within HCI, it's important to realize that we should be critical about who we work with and understand that not all policy informing organizations work from research-driven political agendas. So to continue with the findings, I addressed that policy informers, such as HCI researchers, should become visible and relevant to policymakers. But that's not enough. You need to understand that policy informing doesn't happen in one go. It's not working as a drive-by. Instead, you need to grow and invest in long-term engagement that are reciprocal, and through that reciprocal interaction, we can develop an understanding of what it means to develop policy. So according to the participants, as we learn from their practice, for example, that we shouldn't go to policymakers and try to give them a broad education on everything we know, we should present our work in ways that fits their practice and priorities. So as a policy informer, it's our duty to become a credible way to evidence. As some participants put it, we should become guides to literature. So moving into what this means for HCI and how it helps us to develop a policy informing practice, what we came to see in another finding that's in the paper, but which we won't go into here, the fact that the large data scales, often of quantitative nature, are still privileged in policy making. So knowing that HCI work is rather fragmented based on its contextual nature, but also due to the smaller sample sets that we use, the value and power of HCI might not lie in individual case studies. Instead, we can make use of the intermediary organizations such as HCI, its local chapters, and national alternatives to bring together researchers and their work based on policy topics. So by bringing these together, we might not only have a better evidence base to bring to policy makers, we can also respond to our own critical discussions that are taking place within our research field. So to move into theme 2. Experimenting with new types of evidence in evidence-based policy making. Because there might be a very interesting opportunity for a very niche strand of research. And therefore, in this section of the talk, I will go into the experimental developments of what constitutes evidence in evidence-based policymaking, but also the kind of challenges that policymakers and informers are currently experiencing. So what we noticed is that the interview participants described that they're taking more and more interventionist approaches to include to approach and to mobilize and engage communities to gather practical evidence. This resonates very strongly with participatory approaches within HCI. But how to use public engagement and the opinion of the public, and make it part of policymaking is seen as a challenge. Partly because those quantitative data is still privileged in policymaking, according to the interviewees. In contrast, HCI has developed very strong methods in how to use the citizen's voice or in order to capture people's accounts around technology. And we are able to bring these insights forward as evidence in our academic research. Another element of experimentation has been based on the natural future orientation of policy. According to the think tank professionals we spoke to, the work of policymakers generally incorporates visions of the policy in a nearby and far future, say the next year, 5 or 10 years ahead. Interesting particularly was to hear from one participant how they reflected on collaborations with speculative designers to help them and citizens to think about and scrutinize different versions of policy futures. So getting the reactions from citizens directly was considered very valuable, but again, finding out how to make this part of policy-making processes in an evidence-based culture was found much harder. So mind me for taking a bit of a jump here, but as we've seen that both participatory approaches and speculative approaches are experimented with within the context of evidence-based policymaking, there might be an interesting opportunity for those HCI researchers who combine these methods in their own practice. So those who combine participatory and speculative methods, such as co-speculation and speculative enactments, might want to mature these methods in ways that they fit the practices of policymaking. And this is not with the intention to take over the more conventional types of data and evidence that are used in policymaking, but instead we can find ways to make them sit alongside these forms of data in structured ways that meet the priorities of policymakers. So to summarize, in the first theme, we address the whole of the HCI community, and we think that there's a value in bringing together different types of evidence that we collect in our work. And based on doing that, we can inform policy topics, but also tackle some of the internal issues that we have as a community on fragmentation and scale. And of course, we can make use of the organizational the intermediary organizations that we use in order to bring people together, such as the CHI conference. But also, in our second theme, we want to address a niche trend of HCI research. Those who combine participatory and speculative methods might want to consider seriously how to mature their methods in ways that fit outside the HCI community and in, for example, policy-making practices. So I hope that I've helped you to understand the boundaries that currently exist between policy-making and HCI. And I also want to thank all of the participants that have shared their experiences with us during this study, so that together we can bring forward our evidence to policymakers and also develop practices that enable us to engage with policymakers on the longer term. So for now, I'm very happy to take your questions, but if you want to reach me after the conference, you can find my email address on the slide, and I'm happy to talk more about this.
Thank you, Anna. We've got plenty of time for questions, so do we have some questions? Just a reminder too that there's microphones at either end of the auditorium and a roaming mic, a student volunteer with a roaming mic, so if anyone is in the middle and can't get to the microphone, just raise your hand. Okay, I might start then. I think it's really important that we're involved in policy making, but I wonder if you've got any comment on the impact that might have on how we manage to do it all in our work life. I'm curious about lots of calls to action to get involved in lots of other things and having social impact, which I think is really important, but of course these things all have an impact on how much we can do in our work.
Yeah. Well, I think I don't know whether we mentioned this like word by word in the paper, but most of the academics in our field have more than full-time jobs. So asking someone to become a policy informer next to their full-time job might not be the most achievable thing. Instead, because there's an interesting opportunity to bring our methods to policymaking as well, there might be an opportunity to, and this is also something that I highlighted in the presentation, invest in those long-term and reciprocal interactions. So that means that, for example, you start your study, and from the start of that research, you involve partners that can inform policymakers later on and during that process. So, for example, it's something that we left out of the presentation, but is a big part of the paper. There might be value in finding policy informing organizations such as think tanks, finding the credible think tank, someone who is an organization that is an expert in your field of research, might help us to bring our evidence outside the community.
Corina Sass, Lancaster University. Thank you very much for a very beautiful presentation and useful piece of work. There is an extensive push towards making our research more socially relevant and impactful. So my question would be, to which extent your findings might go beyond HCI towards other disciplines, and what's really specific about HCI in what you found out?
So one of the things that initiated this study was that there's, across other disciplines of research, there is a very strong policy informing practice. So, for example, healthcare, social sciences, but also the more the data science, for example, or those that investigate AI and IoT. What we found is quite unique to HCI is that we develop personal and nuanced accounts of technology rather than focusing purely on the opportunities of technology. We have rather critical reflections on what it means to engage with something like IoT on an everyday basis. As government, in this case, has its role to, in a way, guide society and help to create the best possible situation for their citizens. It might actually be that the fact that we are such an interdisciplinary field of research and that we sit between all those specific elements of a complex problem. Next to that, just the methods that we found are experimented with in policymaking is something that we already do, and we have a couple of decades experience in that. So finding out that this is happening within government, at least in the UK, might be quite a unique opportunity for HCI to respond to.
Thank you. Any more questions?
On the left.
Yes.
Hi, Richmond Wong from the University of California, Berkeley. Thank you for a great presentation. I really like this idea of bringing kind of participatory and speculative design methods in engagement with policymaking. And like at first glance, it seems like speculative design as a practice seems very different than the day-to-day professional practice of policymaking. And wondering if you have thoughts about how, as design researchers, to engage in that community at kind of a, practice and methods level.
Yeah. Well, I think it's an opportunity and a challenge at the same time. There's a lot of work there's some work taking place in government to experiment with the speculative methods because government is a long-term practice, so you can't benefit current generations by being detrimental to next generations. For example, sustainability is one of the most common examples, but the other way around, you can't be progressive, as one of the participants mentioned, is by being detrimental to the current generation in order to preserve the next generation. So it's an integral element of policy making, and in the more informal ways of engaging in design, having more informal ways of engaging speculation in policymaking might make policymakers more comfortable with speculating, especially in an evidence-based practice where everything needs to be true or proven in order to make a decision. It's interesting how those two movements are happening at the same time within policymaking, and it's definitely a challenge and might not be resolved in the next, I don't know how many years, but we can at least try and help this development from our community.